The eviction notice was not a letter, but an indictment. Stapled to the weathered wood of Eleanor Vance's front door, it fluttered in the grimy city breeze, a white flag of surrender she had not waved. Marcus Thorne stood on her walkway, his polished shoes a stark insult to the cracked concrete. He was a man built of sharp angles and cheap suits, his smile a thin, predatory line. He didn't just want her house. He wanted her gone, erased from the block he intended to gut and rebuild into sterile, overpriced condominiums. He had made sure to serve the notice himself, in the full light of day, turning her private struggle into a public spectacle. From behind drawn curtains and slatted blinds, the neighborhood watched. Their silence was a heavy blanket, woven with threads of pity, fear, and a faint, shameful judgment. She was the quiet widow, the one who kept to herself, a ghost in a house that held too many memories. Now, she was a problem, a delay in the inevitable march of progress that Thorne represented. "Final notice, Eleanor," he said, his voice loud enough for the unseen audience to hear. 30 days. The bank's patience has run out. My patience has run out. He gestured vaguely at the peeling paint on her porch railing, the stubborn dandelions pushing through the walkway. "This place is an eyesore. It's dragging the whole neighborhood down." Eleanor stood in the doorway, a slight woman made smaller by the shadow of the man on her lawn. She clutched the neck of her worn cardigan, her knuckles white. She didn't speak. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could. It was a refusal to participate in her own humiliation. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle, a stubborn bit of grit in the gears of his enterprise. "You can't afford to fight this," he continued, his tone shifting to one of mock sympathy. "You have nothing, no one. It's better to just go, disappear. Take whatever little you have and find a room somewhere." This is over. He turned, a final smirk thrown over his shoulder, and walked back to his gleaming black sedan parked at the curb. The car was as out of place on the street as a diamond in a dustbin. As it purred away, the street exhaled. Curtains twitched open. A few neighbors peeked out, their faces etched with a mixture of relief that it wasn't them and a cold, detached sorrow for her. No one came over. No one offered a word of comfort. They saw her as he did, a lost cause, a ghost already fading. Eleanor remained in the doorway, her gaze fixed on the flapping piece of paper. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the final chapter of a life she had built within these walls. It was the sound of her late husband David's laughter in the kitchen, the spot on the floor where their daughter took her first steps, the window she had looked through while waiting for him to come home from a war he never truly left behind. Thorne was wrong. She did have something. She had this house. It was all she had left. And as she finally reached out and tore the notice from her door, the paper ripping with a quiet, final sound, a spark of defiance flickered in her tired eyes. He thought she had nothing to fight with. She was about to prove him wrong. The days that followed were a slow, suffocating torment. Marcus Thorne was a master of psychological warfare, employing 1,000 small cuts to bleed her resolve dry. He didn't need to send thugs, not yet. His weapon was systemic indifference, the cold machinery of bureaucracy he wielded with surgical precision. Official-looking letters arrived daily, each one filled with legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate, citing obscure zoning violations and property tax arrears she knew had been paid. A city inspector, a man with shifty eyes and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his hand, appeared on her doorstep, pointing out phantom cracks in the foundation and non-existent code infringements on the wiring. He spoke of fines, of condemnation, of the city's power to seize property that was deemed a public hazard. Eleanor knew it was a lie, a performance orchestrated by Thorne, but the threat felt real, a tightening noose of officialdom. She spent hours on the phone, navigating automated menus and indifferent clerks, only to be transferred from one department to another, her voice growing hoarse, her frustration mounting. Each call ended the same way, with a polite but firm dismissal. She was a number, a case file, a minor annoyance in a system designed to serve men like Thorne, not women like her. The community's silence deepened, curdling from passive observation into active avoidance. When she walked to the corner store for milk, Her neighbors would suddenly find something interesting on their phones, or turn to inspect a patch of weeds in their lawn. They crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Their fear was palpable. Thorne's development project promised a new beginning for the neighborhood, a rise in property values, a clean slate. Eleanor was the ghost at the feast, a reminder of the past they were eager to bury. Her struggle was inconvenient, a stain on their bright future. One evening, Thorne appeared again. This time, there was no public spectacle. He came as dusk settled over the street, the fading light casting long, distorted shadows. He found her tending the small patch of stubborn roses that grew by her fence, their deep red blooms a splash of defiant color against the graying house. "Still here, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low, almost intimate murmur. It was more menacing than his previous shouting. "I'm impressed, or perhaps just disappointed in your lack of common sense." She straightened up, her back aching, her hands covered in soil. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "This is my home, Mr. Thorne," he chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It's a building, it's an asset, and its value is about to be realized, with or without you in it. I'm giving you one last chance, out of the goodness of my heart." He stepped closer, invading her space, his cologne cloying and sharp. "I have a check for you, $5,000. Enough to get you a bus ticket and a month's rent in some forgotten town where nobody knows you. You sign the deed over, you take the money, and you walk away." Tonight he held out a cashier's check. It was a pittance, an insult. "If you don't," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the next people I send won't be holding clipboards. They won't be polite. They will make you want to leave. Do you understand me?" The ultimatum hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. It wasn't a business transaction. It was a threat. He was offering her a choice between erasure and annihilation. Alone in the quiet of her house, the scent of Thorne's cheap cologne still lingering in the air, Eleanor sank into the worn armchair in the living room. The fabric was frayed at the arms, indented with the shape of a life lived. This was David's chair. In the dim light, she could almost see him there, his long legs stretched out, a book resting on his chest, a quiet smile on his face. The house wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary of memory, every floorboard groaning with a story, every wall holding the faint echo of laughter. She closed her eyes and let the past wash over her. She remembered David, not the soldier in the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, but the man who taught her how to plant roses, his large, gentle hands showing her how to handle the thorny stems without getting hurt. The man who could fix anything. A leaky faucet, a broken heart, a child's scraped knee. He had been her rock, her anchor. He had come back from the war a different man, quieter, his eyes holding a permanent shadow of the things he had seen. But with her, in this house, he had found a fragile peace. He had a code, a simple set of rules he lived by. "You don't start fights," he used to tell her, his voice a low rumble. "But you don't run from them either. You stand your ground. Not for pride, Ellie. For dignity. It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it away." He had fought for his country, for his brothers in arms, for the idea of home. And this little house on this forgotten street had been his home. Her fingers found the thin silver chain around her neck. She pulled it out from under her collar, the two small, worn dog tags cool against her palm. David Vance. His name, his service number, his blood type. It was a tangible piece of him, a weight she had carried every day since he was gone. He hadn't died in combat. He had survived the dust and fire of a foreign land only to be taken by a quiet, insidious illness that the doctors traced back to the very air he had breathed over there. A slow, cruel betrayal. She had made a promise to him in the sterile, silent hospital room where he took his last breath. Promise to be strong. A promise to keep their home safe, to honor the peace he had found here. Selling it, running away from a bully like Thorne, would be breaking that promise. It would be letting go of the last piece of David she had left. Thorne saw a weak, lonely old woman. He saw peeling paint and a sagging porch. He didn't see the foundation of love and loss upon which this house was built. He didn't understand that her fight wasn't about property value or legal deeds. It was about dignity. It was about a promise made to a good man. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the photograph on the mantel. David, young and proud in his uniform, his arm around her. She stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked to the front door and slid the deadbolt home. The click echoed in the silent house, a small sound of defiance. Thorne could send his letters, his inspectors, his threats. She would not run. She would stand her ground. The day of the deadline arrived with a pale, indifferent sun. The air was thick with a tension that seemed to seep from the very asphalt of the street. Eleanor had not slept. She had spent the night watching the shadows move across her lawn, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs. She was afraid, but a deeper, colder resolve had settled in her bones. This was David's home. She would not be moved. By mid-afternoon they came, not in a sleek sedan, but in a dented, rust-colored panel van that rattled to a stop in front of her house. Two men got out. They were not large or overtly muscular, but they moved with a kind of predatory slouch that was far more intimidating. One was thin and wiry, with a nervous energy that made his eyes dart everywhere. The other was broad and sullen, his face a mask of bored cruelty. They were Thorne's persuasion. The street went dead silent. Doors clicked shut. Blinds were drawn tight. If anyone was watching, they were doing so from the deepest shadows of their homes, their courage failing them. Eleanor watched from her living room window as the men ambled up her walkway. They didn't knock. The wiry one kicked over a terracotta pot of geraniums, shattering it, the red petals scattering like drops of blood on the concrete. The sullen one began to methodically tear the pickets from her front fence, snapping the weathered wood with dull, splintering cracks. They were not trying to get in. Not yet. They were performing. It was a show for her, and for the silent, watching neighbors. A demonstration of power. A message that Thorne's reach extended beyond paperwork and into the realm of physical violation. They wanted to break her spirit before they broke down her door. Eleanor stood perfectly still, her hand once again clutching the dog tags at her neck. Her breath was shallow, but her resolve held. She would not scream. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. They circled the house like wolves, peering into windows, their smudged faces leering at her. The wiry one rattled the doorknob violently, while the other pounded a heavy fist against the wooden frame, the entire house seeming to shudder with each impact. "Old lady," the sullen one grunted, his voice muffled by the door. "Thorne sent us. He said to tell you your time is up. It's time to go." The easy way or the hard way, the silence that followed his words was absolute. The entire world seemed to have shrunk to this small house, this single point of conflict. Eleanor was an island, and the tide was coming in. She knew no one was coming to help. The police would take too long, and even if they came, Thorne would have a plausible story about a property dispute. Her neighbors had already made their choice, locking their doors, choosing their own fragile safety over the defense of a lonely widow. She was utterly, completely alone. The pounding stopped. She heard them muttering to each other outside, their voices low and angry. Then, a new sound. The scraping of metal, the slosh of liquid. A sickening, chemical smell wafted under the door. Gasoline. They weren't just going to break in. They were going to burn her out. The smell of gasoline was a sharp, terrifying punctuation to their threats. It was no longer about intimidation. It was about destruction. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her gaze darted around the living room, at the photographs, the worn armchair, the faded rug. This was not just her home. It was her life, and they were going to set it on fire. Through the front window, she saw the sullen thug sloshing the contents of a red can along the base of her wooden porch, the liquid darkening the old timber. The wiry one stood back, fumbling with a lighter, his thumb flicking nervously over the spark wheel. In that same instant, a flash of pink caught Eleanor's eye from the side yard. It was little Lily, the 6-year-old from 2 houses down, a curious and fearless child who often chased butterflies in the adjacent empty lot. She had slipped out of her backyard, drawn by the commotion her parents were hiding from. She stood near the fence, her eyes wide with a child's innocent fascination, dangerously close to the gasoline-soaked porch. The wiry thug hadn't seen her. He was focused on the lighter, on the task at hand. Time seemed to slow, to stretch into an unbearable, silent scream. Eleanor saw the scene play out in her mind. The flick of the lighter, the whoosh of the flame, the little girl caught in the inferno. Something inside her snapped. It was not thought. It was not reason. It was a pure, primal instinct that bypassed all fear for her own safety. The promise to David, the love for her own child long grown and gone, the simple, fierce human need to protect the innocent. It all coalesced into a single, explosive moment of action. She unbolted the door and threw it open, launching herself onto the porch with a force that surprised even herself. Get away from her! The voice that came out of her was not her own quiet, tired whisper. It was a raw, powerful cry, filled with a righteous fury that had been dormant for years. It was the voice of a wife, a mother, a protector. The two men froze, startled by her sudden appearance. The wiry one dropped his lighter. In that split second of their confusion, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran straight past them, off the side of the porch, and scooped Lily into her arms, turning her body to shield the child from the men and the gasoline. She held the little girl tight, her back to the thugs, a frail but unbreachable wall of flesh and bone. Go home, sweetie, she whispered into Lily's hair, her voice trembling but firm. Run home to your mommy now. She gently pushed the child away, toward the safety of her own yard. Lily, finally scared, scrambled away without a backward glance. Eleanor turned back to face the men. She was breathing heavily, her legs shaking, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made both thugs take an involuntary step back. She was no longer a victim. She was a lioness. The sullen one recovered first, his surprise turning to anger. You crazy old hag, he snarled, advancing on her. But his bravado was hollow. Her selfless, ferocious act had changed the dynamic completely. She had not cowered. She had not begged. She had attacked, not with fists, but with a courage so absolute it was disarming. She had risked everything for a neighbor's child, for a community that had abandoned her, and in that moment, she was more powerful than they could ever be. The sound of Eleanor's furious cry, followed by the sight of her shielding the small child, was the stone that finally shattered the neighborhood's fragile wall of silence. Doors that had been locked creaked open. Curtains were pulled back, not in secret this time, but with a new, urgent purpose. People emerged onto their porches and lawns, their faces a mixture of shame and dawning admiration. They had watched a frail widow do what none of them had dared to. They had witnessed true courage, and it made their own fear feel small and cowardly. The first to speak was Mr. Henderson from across the street, a gruff retiree who usually only communicated in grunts. Hey! He yelled, his voice rusty but loud. You get away from her. Get the hell off her property. His wife appeared beside him, her hand already holding a phone to her ear, her voice sharp and clear as she spoke to a 911 operator. There are two men attacking a woman. Yes, they were trying to set a fire. One voice became two, then five, then a dozen. A chorus of outrage rose from the previously silent houses. We see you, someone shouted. We've got you on camera, another lied. But the effect was the same. The two thugs were suddenly exposed, the anonymity of their bullying stripped away by the collective gaze of the community. They were no longer two predators cornering a lone victim. They were two criminals surrounded by witnesses. They exchanged a panicked look. This was not how the job was supposed to go. They were meant to terrorize a helpless old woman into submission, not become the main attraction in a neighborhood watch drama. The sullen one took one more menacing step toward Eleanor, but the roar of the crowd grew louder, more aggressive. He stopped, defeated. The power had shifted entirely. With a final, venomous glare at Eleanor, he spat on the ground. This ain't over, he muttered, but the threat was empty. He grabbed his wiry companion by the arm and they scrambled back to their van, the jeers and shouts of the neighbors following them. They sped away, leaving behind the stench of gasoline, a broken fence, and a community transformed. A profound silence fell in their wake, but this was a different kind of silence. It was not born of fear, but of awe. The neighbors looked at Eleanor, who was still standing in her yard, her small frame trembling with adrenaline. They didn't see the strange, reclusive widow anymore. They saw the woman who had faced down thugs. They saw the woman who had protected one of their children when they themselves had hidden. Whispers rippled through the small crowd. "Did you see that? She was so brave. I can't believe we just let it happen." A quiet but powerful wave of respect washed over the street. Mrs. Henderson crossed the road, her face etched with concern and apology. "Eleanor," she said softly, "are you all right? We are so sorry." One by one, others followed, stepping off their lawns and onto hers, closing the distance she had maintained for so long, a silent, collective apology for their cowardice. Just as the neighbors began to gather around Eleanor, a new sound cut through the air, low and guttural at first, a distant tremor that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. It was a sound that didn't belong on this quiet, residential street. It grew steadily, a deep, rhythmic thunder that seemed to make the very air hum. Every head turned toward the end of the block. A single, powerful headlight cut through the afternoon haze, then another and another, until a phalanx of them appeared. A column of motorcycles, chrome gleaming, engines roaring in a synchronized, intimidating symphony, turned onto the street. They were Hell's Angels. Their presence was overwhelming, a sudden and shocking injection of leather, steel, and menace into the suburban tableau. There were at least 20 of them, their Harleys moving with a slow, deliberate purpose, taking up the entire width of the road. They were a tide of black leather vests, road-worn denim, and faces set like stone behind beards and sunglasses. The newly courageous neighbors froze, their brief moment of unity dissolving back into individual pockets of fear. This was a different kind of threat, one they didn't understand. The bikers rolled to a stop, forming a loose, semicircular barricade in front of Eleanor's house. The synchronized cut of their engines plunged the street into a sudden, ringing silence, a silence more profound and terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. Doors that had just opened began to inch shut again. At the head of the formation, a man swung his leg over a massive, blacked-out bike. He was older than the rest, his beard shot through with gray, his shoulders broad and powerful under a vest heavy with patches. A large patch on his back identified him as the president. His name was Silas. He took off his sunglasses, his eyes scanning the scene with a calm, analytical gaze. The broken fence, the shattered pot, the dark stain of gasoline on the porch, the small crowd of nervous neighbors, and finally, Eleanor, standing alone in the middle of it all. He had been leading his chapter on a ride through the city outskirts when they had turned down a side street and seen the end of the confrontation from a block away, the thugs scrambling into their van, the small woman standing defiant. Curiosity, and a finely tuned instinct for trouble, had brought them here. Silas didn't speak. He just watched, his presence a massive, silent question mark. His men sat on their bikes, their engines ticking as they cooled, their collective stare a heavy weight on the neighborhood. They were not police. They were not saviors. They were observers, a force of nature that had arrived unbidden, and no one knew if they were there to witness the aftermath or to become a part of it. The air crackled with unspoken possibilities. The fear that Thorne's thugs had inspired was nothing compared to the primal uncertainty stirred by the arrival of this leather-clad army. They were a law unto themselves, and they had just claimed this broken piece of sidewalk as their territory. Silas dismounted, his heavy boots making a solid, deliberate sound on the pavement. He moved with an unhurried grace that belied his size, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. The other bikers remained by their machines, a silent, watchful honor guard. The neighbors shrank back, melting toward their own properties, leaving a wide, clear space around the two figures at the center of the street. Eleanor did not retreat. She stood her ground, her exhaustion and adrenaline giving way to a strange, weary calm. She had faced down bullies and fire. She would not be intimidated by the quiet gaze of one more man, no matter how formidable. Silas stopped a few feet from her. He wasn't looking at her with pity or aggression. There was something else in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked like recognition, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. His gaze dropped from her face to her neck, to the place where her hand still rested, protectively, over the front of her cardigan. The thin silver chain of David's dog tags was visible against her skin. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It was a voice accustomed to being heard over the roar of engines and the noise of crowded bars, yet it was surprisingly respectful. "That necklace you're wearing, it wasn't a question, but a statement." Eleanor's hand tightened instinctively. "They were my husband's," she said, her own voice quiet but clear in the heavy silence. Silas took a step closer, his eyes focused on the glint of metal. "May I?" he asked, his tone gentle. Hesitantly, she nodded. She pulled the chain over her head, the two small tags resting in her palm. She held them out for him to see. He didn't touch them. He leaned in, his weathered face inches from her hand, and read the name stamped into the worn steel. "Vance? David." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, a deep, profound shift that seemed to momentarily soften the hard lines etched around his eyes. He straightened up slowly, his gaze meeting hers again. This time there was no doubt. He knew the name. "Doc," Silas breathed, the name a quiet prayer, an old memory given voice. His name was David. "We called him Doc." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. How could this man, this intimidating biker, know her quiet, gentle David? "You knew him?" she whispered. "Knew him?" Silas let out a short, rough sound that might have been a laugh in another life. "Ma'am, David Vance saved my life. Kandahar. We were pinned down, taking heavy fire. I caught a piece of shrapnel in my leg, was bleeding out in the dust. Everyone else was keeping their heads down, but not document. He ran through hell itself, dragged me back to cover, and patched me up while bullets were kicking up sand all around us. He was the bravest man I ever knew." He looked past her at the small, unassuming house. He always talked about this place, about his Ellie, about the roses by the fence. He said it was the only thing that kept him sane over there. The truth of it settled over the street, as stunning and unexpected as the biker's arrival. David Vance, the quiet veteran, was not just a memory in a widow's home. He was a hero, a brother, his legacy carried in the heart of the formidable man standing before her. The Hell's Angels hadn't come here by chance. They had been led here, by the ghost of a fallen comrade, to the home of the woman he had loved. The revelation hung in the air, fundamentally altering the fabric of the moment. The bikers were no longer a random, menacing force. They were pilgrims who had found a sacred place. Silas turned to his men. He didn't need to shout. He simply raised his hand and pointed a single, leather-gloved finger at Eleanor's house. "This house," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute, "is under our protection. This is Doc Vance's home. Nobody touches it. Nobody touches her." The words were a decree. A silent, collective nod passed through the ranks of the bikers. Their posture shifted. They were no longer observing. They were guarding. Several of them dismounted, moving with quiet efficiency to form a loose perimeter around Eleanor's property. One stood at the end of her broken walkway. Two more flanked the edges of her lawn. They were silent sentinels, their presence a promise of swift and brutal reprisal against any who would dare harm what they now protected. Just then, as if summoned by the drama, Marcus Thorne's black sedan turned onto the street. He had likely come to survey the damage, to see if his message had been received. He drove slowly, a confident smirk on his face, expecting to see a broken woman and a terrorized neighborhood. The smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief and confusion. He saw not a defeated widow, but a woman standing tall, flanked by the president of a notorious motorcycle club. He saw his path blocked by a wall of polished chrome and black leather. He saw 24 bikers staring at him with cold, predatory stillness. Thorn slammed on his brakes. Silas walked calmly into the middle of the street, planting himself directly in front of Thorn's car. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a single threatening gesture. He simply stood there, an immovable object of leather and loyalty. "You must be Thorn," Silas said, his voice carrying easily to the open car window. Thorn, flustered, tried to regain his composure. "This is a private property dispute," he blustered. "It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with us now," Silas replied, his voice flat and cold. "The woman in that house is family. You and your boys will not come back here. You will not call her. You will not send her another letter. This dispute is over. Are we clear?" The threat was unspoken but perfectly understood. Thorn looked from Silas's granite face to the unblinking stares of the bikers lining the road. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal, intelligent fear. He was a bully who preyed on the weak and isolated. He had no power here. He nodded mutely, unable to form words. "Good," Silas said. "Now get off this street. And don't come back." Thorn fumbled with his gearshift, his hands shaking. He executed a clumsy three-point turn and sped away, his expensive car looking like a frightened cockroach scurrying from the light. As he disappeared, a cheer went up from the neighbors. The fear they had felt was replaced by a surge of communal triumph. Emboldened by the biker's stand, they began to act. Mr. Henderson emerged from his garage with a hammer and a box of nails and began wordlessly repairing Eleanor's fence. His wife appeared with a tray of lemonade. Others brought brooms to sweep up the shattered pot, garbage bags for the debris, and offers of help, their voices filled with a respect that had been absent just an hour before. They were not just fixing a fence. They were mending a community, with Eleanor and her unlikely guardians at its heart. The days that followed settled into a new, unbelievable rhythm. The street was transformed. The fear that had permeated the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. 2 bikers were always there, parked at the curb in front of Eleanor's house. They sat on their Harleys or leaned against the newly repaired fence, a constant, silent presence. They didn't speak much, acknowledging the neighbors with a curt nod, but their message was clear. This ground was protected. The community, for its part, continued its atonement. Every morning, Eleanor would find a small offering on her porch, a basket of fresh vegetables from someone's garden, a warm loaf of bread, a thermos of coffee for her guardians. They stopped to talk to her now, not with pity, but with a deep and genuine respect. They asked about David, wanting to hear stories of the man whose quiet heroism had, in a way, saved them all. Eleanor, who had been isolated for so long, found herself slowly, cautiously, rejoining the world. She shared stories of David's kindness, his quiet humor, the way he loved the scent of her roses after a rainstorm. In sharing him, she brought a part of him back to life, not just for herself, but for the entire neighborhood. Silas visited every evening. He would pull up, dismount, and share a cup of coffee with Eleanor on her porch. He told her more about David, about Doc. He spoke of his calm under fire, his steady hands, his ability to make a joke even in the most terrifying of circumstances. He told her how David had talked endlessly of his Ellie, showing his platoon mates her picture until the photo was worn and soft at the edges. He explained that many of the men in his chapter were veterans, men who, like David, had struggled to find their place in the world after the war. The club was their family, their brotherhood, the one place they felt understood. "He was one of us, Eleanor," Silas said one evening, his gaze on the setting sun. "He never wore a patch, but he was a brother. We look after our own. We didn't know where you were. I'm sorry it took us so long to find you." Eleanor simply shook her head, a small, grateful smile on her face. "You found me when I needed you most." One afternoon, Silas arrived with a small, carefully wrapped package. He handed it to her. Inside, on a bed of black velvet, was a small, embroidered patch. It wasn't a club patch with their insignia. It was simpler, more personal. It was a pair of angel wings stitched in silver thread, with the name DOC embroidered in the center. "It's not official," Silas explained, his voice gruff with emotion. "It's just a way for us to remember him, a way for us to honor you. You're part of this family now, Eleanor." Forever, tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she traced the stitching with her finger. It was a symbol of recognition, of belonging. She was no longer just a widow. She was the keeper of a hero's memory, embraced by a brotherhood forged in loyalty and fire. Marcus Thorne was never seen on the street again. Word filtered back that his development project had stalled, that his investors had pulled out after hearing about his methods and the powerful new friends the lone holdout on the property had made. His empire of intimidation had crumbled when faced with a force it couldn't bully or buy. The eviction notice was a forgotten memory, a scrap of paper that had lost all its power. The final symbol of her victory was a quiet one. A new deed arrived in the mail one day, delivered by a courier. It was for her house. It was paid in full. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. The Brotherhood had quietly, decisively, settled her debts. Her home was truly hers, secured not by lawyers, but by loyalty.